The jury will not be sequestered.
I'm Brian Buckmeyer along with Terry Allison.
In the Weinstein case, fellow silence breakers and any
Jury selection is moving along
Well,
here.
I'll read the verdict, says Jesse Weber. Thanks for joining
We
us.
don't tend to see it as raw as this.
Good evening and welcome. And welcome to Night Court at the Law and Crime Network, everybody. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. We have a lot to talk about, lot to cover, from the latest in the hunt for Brian Laundrie to the trials of R. Kelly and Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes. But right now, I want to recap the latest in our Flagstaff, Arizona trial of former U.S. Air Force member Mark Gooch. Now, Gooch is accused of murdering 27-year-old Sasha Kraus, a Mennonite Sunday school teacher from New Mexico back in January of last year. He faces life in prison for charges including premeditated first-degree murder, kidnapping, and theft. Now, the courtroom is currently on an afternoon break, so while we wait for that to return, I'm going to keep a careful eye on the courtroom feed. Let's take a listen to what's happened already so far. And we're going to start with Prosecutor Amon Barker. He delivered his opening statement to the jury this afternoon. Now, I just want to let you know, any of you true crime fans who've been following the Law and Crime Network from the very beginning, back all the way in the day, he was a part of one of the very first trials we covered, the Stephen Jones trial of the Arizona University shooting. So pretty incredible that he's back on the Law and Crime Network, and we're watching him deliver another opening. Take a look.
We were talking about the resentment the defendant had against Mennonites. Now that morning, the morning of January 18, 2020, the defendant got into his car, a VW Jetta, and he drove north up the I-17 past Flagstaff and then turned towards the east, toward New Mexico. Eventually, he arrived in the town of Farmington, New Mexico. Now, this was a Saturday. It was the defendant's day off, and yet he chose that day to drive 7 hours to an obscure community on the eastern edge of Farmington, New Mexico, the place where Sasha lived, the Lamp and Light community. Now, there's no indication the defendant knew anybody at that community. Nobody at that community knew the defendant. And yet he spent roughly 4 hours in that area. It's unclear exactly what he was doing that entire time. He never introduced himself to anyone in that community. Nobody even knew he was there. Meanwhile, Sasha was having a very typical Saturday. She was doing some personal shopping, running some errands. She was preparing, in fact, to move into a different house in that community. She had told a roommate earlier that day that she had to go pick up some books at the church building for a lesson the next day being a Sunday. That night, around 7:30 p.m., she got into her car and she drove to the church. She was wearing a white fleece jacket, long pinstripe dress. Her hair was done up in a bun pinned together with the customary head covering. Now, you'll hear that the church building from Sasha's house was not far, 200 feet maybe, but it was cold, it was January, and it was dark, and it would not have been unusual for her to drive that short distance. Now, what happened when Sasha got to the church is not entirely clear. But what will be clear is that the defendant was there, that he abducted Sasha, put her in his car, and then drove hours away to the area of the Sunset Crater National Monument. Nobody saw this happen. Nobody even heard anything. Nobody knew Sasha was missing, in fact, until much later that night. Around 1:30 a.m. the next morning, this is January 19th, one of Sasha's roommates woke up, noticed that there was a light on, a light that they had left on for Sasha, in fact. Sasha wasn't there. She nervously texted another roommate asking where Sasha was. They tried calling her, no answer, went straight to voicemail. Soon others in the community started waking up. The police arrived at the scene. A search began for Sasha. But as you'll learn, by that time, Sasha was likely already dead. The defendant had removed her from her community, taken her hours away, as I mentioned, to the Sunset Crater National Monument. He was driving down some of those remote roads after midnight on the 19th. At some point, The defendant duct taped Sasha's wrists together in front of her. He bashed her head so hard that it caused skull fractures. And then he pulled out his .22 caliber rifle. He pointed it at the back of her head and fired one shot, killing her. Sasha's body remained in that area, face down in some cinders, while the defendant got into his car and drove back to his Air Force base.
All right, let's break it down. Joining me right now, attorneys Tammy Allison and Ann Bremner both join me. It's great to see you both. Tammy, I'll start with you. Now, I know, everybody knows, anybody who follows this trial knows that motive is not an element of a crime. We've said that countless times. I just find it so odd here because, and we're going to get into all the evidence the prosecution has, you have a guy who seemingly had no connection to her. We even heard from a witness earlier today who said, you know, Krause never mentioned a Mark Gooch before. It just seems so odd and so random, and I know it can happen, but is that going to be a difficulty for the prosecution here?
Thank you for having me. I don't think that it would necessarily be a difficulty for the prosecution. I think what we're hearing here in the opening statements are the prosecutor laying the foundation to meet those very relevant elements in order for the jury to check off their list whenever they get those jury instructions to find this defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It is very odd. It is very random. It is really strange to have some type of motive to murder someone just based off of their faith. But again, the standard of proof here is beyond a reasonable doubt. And I do think that the prosecution laying it out and connecting the dots for the jury to understand how she was brutally murdered is going to assist in them maybe finding the defendant guilty.
But Ann, generally speaking, we're talking about something of a situation, a brutal crime here, like blunt force trauma, gunshot to the back of the head. The defense, even in their cross-examination today, seemed to suggest, you could argue, maybe this was something that was done within the community. Maybe someone like Lucinda Horst, who actually was a friend of the defendant, they had a little bit of tension going on in work. Were they suggesting that maybe she had something to do there? So the question is this seems so personal, this attack, but the prosecution's saying it was not. What do you think?
Well, I think that, I mean, obviously, hatred for the Mennonites was, arguable hatred for the Mennonites was channeled into a Mennonite. And so you can say it's personal in that respect. But, you know, the fact is, like you said, we don't have to prove motive as prosecutors. And clearly, he's linked to this crime by cell phone records, financial records, and surveillance. And that's the kind of evidence that speaks to a jury, more than evidence of a true motive. But I think it's there, given what we know so far.
I'm glad you mentioned the evidence. Let's get into it a little bit. So Prosecutor Barker went into the actual evidence the state has against this defendant. Take a look.
You'll see images like this one. This is a mapped version of where the defendant, his cell phone was located from his AT&T records. Every red circle there that you can see, every dot, indicates a coordinate from AT&T. There are, as you'll hear, about 2,000 of these dots that create a sort of breadcrumb trail that you can follow. Now, the other thing that this record will show is the time the defendant was in these locations. And for that reason, you'll hear that the defendant was in Farmington, New Mexico, up until the point of Sasha's disappearance. You'll hear that he was in the Sunset Crater National Monument area after midnight on January the 19th for around 2 hours. The same area where Sasha's body was later recovered. In summary, the defendant was at the abduction site and at the murder site on the dates and times when those events occurred. Now, you'll hear other evidence in the case that will support that timeline. For instance, as you might, and the defendant had to do that as well when he returned on January 19th at around 7 a.m. That timeline corresponds with the AT&T records as well. There was also surveillance video on the Air Force Base, which showed the defendant leaving his dorm in the morning of January 18th, getting into his VW Jetta, leaving the base, and then again returning on January 19th at around 7 a.m. Police also obtained the defendant's financial records. You'll hear that his American Express account showed 2 transactions during that trip he took from Glendale to Farmington. One transaction at a McDonald's in Kayenta, Arizona, and another transaction at a gas station in Farmington. And the timestamps for those transactions, again, matches up with that timeline from his AT&T cell record. And then you have the device itself, the cell phone the defendant had with him while he was making this trip and committing these acts. And there were 2 photos on that cell phone that he took while he was driving from Glendale to Flagstaff on I-17. And the timestamps on those photos match up again with the timeline from his AT&T record. Now, if that wasn't enough, the defendant also admitted that he drove from Glendale to Farmington on January 18th. You see, after Detective Nagel obtained these cell phone records, she went to go speak to him at his base. And she asked him early in the interview if he had traveled outside of the state in the last 6 months. This was an interview done in April of last year. The defendant initially lied, said no, and then later in the interview, he admitted he had in fact driven to New Mexico on the date of Sasha's disappearance. Now, his explanation was that he was just going to attend a Mennonite church there. Another contradiction. He drove there on a Saturday, not on a Sunday when the services would have been held, never introduced himself to anyone in that community. And in fact, later in that same interview, he told Detective Nagel he had no intention of attending any Mennonite churches. Now, the defendant in that interview claims he had nothing to do with Sasha's disappearance. You'll get to watch this interview in its entirety. It was audio and video recorded. You'll get to see what contradictions there are in that interview, what's contradicted by the evidence from what the defendant is telling you. And you'll get to judge for yourself if the defendant is telling the truth or if he's simply trying to cover his tracks.
Well, Tammy, you can hear Prosecutor Barker's very confident in the evidence that the prosecution has. And for me, you know, I heard this kind of lab report that seems to match the bullet that was taken from the victim, matched a gun that was owned by Gooch. For me, that's really hard-hitting evidence, but you hear more about the surveillance, his own words, tracking his movements. What do you think?
I think the prosecution, again, is doing a really good job at laying the foundation so that whenever we get into the nitty-gritty details, the jury is going to be able to recall these opening statements and recall that the only person that could be responsible for this gruesome murder of this innocent young woman is the defendant here in this case. I don't see how the defense is going to be able to overcome this type of very relevant and specific evidence. I understand that there could have been someone else that she had some issues with that possibly could raise doubt, but I'm not sure that that's going to be enough doubt that the defense can raise in order to poke a hole into into the prosecution's arguments, and the jury just may find this defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
And you hear the defense basically, trying to say, well, he's admitting that he went there, wanted to check it out, wasn't too bad, might have took a nap at some point. And you know what's interesting, though? I keep getting questions about this. Is this a hate crime? If he's found guilty, is this a hate crime? Could this be more than the charges he's just facing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, do you think so, Jesse? I mean, I think that if you're dealing with somebody's religion, and it depends on the statute and the state, but it basically, if you're attacking somebody based upon their religious beliefs, you could arguably make that kind of an argument. I'm not familiar with the statutes in that state, but it is based on her religion, and it's a strong case, as we just talked about. And the prosecutor's opening, I think, is one. We've heard that statistic where jurors make up their minds in an opening statement, and 80% of the time, whatever they decide in opening is what they end up with in their verdict. There's no basis for that in evidence, but you hear it said all the time. So what was just presented was pretty compelling.
I don't know. I hope not. I want jurors to listen to all the evidence before they make a decision, but I know you're right. I know you're right. I know you're right. We're going to take a break. We're keeping a careful eye on the courtroom feed. I see the seal. Nothing happening quite yet. When we come back, if we can't jump live, We're going to talk about R. Kelly because now his fate is in the hands of a jury. We'll be back.